this is part 2 of Schomburg, the man who built a library. So far, we've learned a little bit about Arturo Schomburg and his love for books and reading and words, and we found out that he has been looking and finding new information about Black people, about African people. So we've talked about Benjamin Banneker, we've talked about Arturo being an immigrant to the United States. We've talked about him continuing to hunt for new and different books, as well as him looking into Phyllis Wheatley's work. And lastly, we looked at his work, diving more into his interest and connection to Frederick Douglass. So let's continue on. Revolutionaries. As Schomburg's search went on, he bought not only books, but also art, letters, prints, and rare African cameos. His was a war to combat ignorance and shatter lies. He needed an arsenal for that. From the past, Arturo enlisted an army of exemplars. His boyhood hero was Toussaint Louverture, leader of the revolt that liberated slaves in Haiti. Later, Arturo purchased military orders signed by Louverture himself. A freed slave with property and money, he risked all to join the slave revolt. Just a generation after American independence, Louverture led a revolution that lasted 12 years and cost thousands of lives. His troops fought off first the French, then the British, and finally the Spanish before victory was won and a Black republic was born, Haiti. For colonies and countries founded on slavery, the Haitian Revolution was a hurricane. Whispers of Louverture's name made slaveholders shudder. Contrary to popular belief, slaves did rise up, and not just in the glorious liberation of Haiti. Arturo eventually traced the roots of rebellion to early America. He read the radical pamphlet that David Walker, a free Black merchant, published in 1829, an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, calling for slaves to rise up, a fiery tract that was banned in its day. Arturo studied the 1893 mutiny on the slave ship Amistad and the court case that followed. Some states soon outlawed anti-slavery literature and forbade Blacks from learning to read. What did slaveholders fear? In South Carolina and Virginia, Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser planned uprisings, and in Virginia, Nat Turner carried out his vision. His 1831 insurrection brought together 70 Blacks, slave and free, and left 57 whites dead. Arturo breathed in his hero's brave words. In this way, Schomburg was a revolutionary too. Three Elizabeths. Arturo first married in 1895, the same year he adopted the English version of his name, Arthur. Elizabeth Hatcher of Staunton, Virginia, was his bride. She died young, leaving her husband to raise two sons, Maximo Gomez, Kingsley Gorenex, and a third, Arturo Alfonso Jr., died in infancy. His second wife was Elizabeth Morrow Taylor, also from Virginia. From their union came two more children, Reginald Stanfield and Nathaniel Jose. Both boys lived in Virginia with their half-brothers and their mother's mother. It was common then for parents who worked in cities to send their children off to be raised by kin. On visits to the South, Arturo bristled at the color line. When the second Elizabeth passed on, he married another, Elizabeth Green. They were blessed with three children, Fernando, Dolores Marie, and Placido Carlos. Despite their Spanish names, Schomburg wouldn't let his offspring learn his native tongue. They were Americans. Whitewash. In his quest for Black glory, Arturo Schomburg navigated a maze of misinformation that stripped Africans' humanity and branded them as less than to justify slavery. The system was based on skin color, superiority, and inferiority, and was necessary, argued aristocrats, to build fortunes and empires. Arturo suspected a conspiracy of fraud that aimed to erase all African history but bondage. Arturo saw that the historical record was colorblind only when that best served greedy motives. So when genius was black, skin color was left out. But Schomburg chased the truth and turned up icons whose African heritage had been whitewashed. Arturo found African roots in the family tree of artist, ornithologist, and naturalist John James Audubon. His masterpiece was the book Birds of America. With watercolors, pastel crayons, charcoal, and pencils, he depicted North American birds in stunning lifelike poses. Yet, for all of Audubon's fame, there was rarely mention that he was born to a French plantation owner and Creole chambermaid. As a boy, Arturo read The Three Musketeers. I used to lose myself in that book, he later wrote, and think I was fighting with Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. He memorized their motto, all for one for all. But he had no inkling that the author, Frenchman Alexandre Dumas, was descended from slaves. Why had Arturo not learned that as a child? Arturo discovered that Russia had its Black Star too. The great poet Alexander Pushkin, the father of that country's modern literature. His first work published when he was just 15. His great-grandfather was Abram Ganabol, who was kidnapped as a child in Central Africa, served in the court of Peter the Great, and rose to become a general and aristocrat himself. No wonder Pushkin was famed for fighting duels. Even German composer Ludwig van Beethoven had ties to Africa. He was often described as dark, a mulatto, or a Moor. His mother, said to be a Moor, North African. Gifted beyond belief, Beethoven still composed after he'd lost his hearing. How could this maestro's African heritage have been muted? How could Arturo ever behold Beethoven's Fifth Symphony without hearing African drumming? Seafaring. Arturo was becoming quite the collector. He nabbed 2 volumes by Paul Cuffey, an early American whaler, shipbuilder, and maritime trader whose fleet sailed the United States Atlantic coast, to the Caribbean, and to Europe. On ships he built, Cuffey and his crew whaled in the waters of the Atlantic. This was dirty and dangerous work, but necessary. First, harpoons flew, and later, blubber was rendered into whale oil for lamps to light growing cities. Paul Cuffey was one of the richest black men in early America. He could afford to speak his mind. Cuffey wrote a petition that free blacks should be able to vote since they paid taxes. And he was the first to float the back to Africa idea. He could see free blacks and free slaves settling in Sierra Leone someday. Cuffey sailed there, set foot on the West African soil to judge if its new society might root. At the White House, he reported that his dream to send 1 vessel to Africa each year. One vessel to each Africa each year held promise. In Cuffey, Arturo found a forerunner to Marcus Garvey, the Harlem Renaissance leader who preached black pride, self-help, and, like Cuffey, a century earlier, a return to Africa. In the 1920s, Arturo supported Garvey, his newspaper Negro World, and his Black Star steamship line. As the Garveyites paraded down Harlem's 125th Street in plumed hats and tasseled brass button uniforms, did Paul Cuffey's voyage cross Arturo's mind? Bloodhound. Though a mailroom clerk at a bank by day, Arturo rubbed shoulders with Alain Locke, dubbed the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and he corresponded with Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute, and W.E.B. Du Bois, an Atlanta University professor and the first African-American to earn a doctorate from Howard. The two disagreed about whether to push for social or economic progress, but they agreed that Black history could be a bridge. Arturo's acquaintances were a who's who of the Harlem Renaissance. He was invited to the first meeting of an informal guild of young black writers. Poets, County Cullen and Langston Hughes were members. So was novelist and poet Jesse Redmond Fawcett, an editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, and of the African-American children's magazine, The Brownies Book. These writers joined Arna Bontemps, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and artist Aaron Douglas in asking Arturo to hunt for historic references that could water the seeds of creative and scholarly endeavors. His collection, fertile soil for growing black pride. When it came to digging up rare finds and obscure facts, Arturo had what poet Claude McKay called a bloodhound's nose. Arturo loaned not only books to students, artists, and writers, he also lent interpretations, insight, and sometimes cash. With book lists full of texts that Schomburg found, his friends mined blackness and broke new ground. Home. Busy, always busy, said Fernando of his father, Arturo Schomburg. He was gone, traveling on lecture tours or collecting missions for what seemed like 8 months each year. And when he was home in Brooklyn, he was out most evenings for club and lodge meetings. His visiting children lived among the countless books in his collection. His only daughter, Dolores, greeted artists and scholars who came by to view his growing library. Arturo's wife, Elizabeth, fought to carve out living space for the family. But that was a losing battle. Her efforts to clean his desk also in vain. When she cleared the clutter to dust, he complained that important references were misplaced. She finally left well enough alone. I think I'm gonna make this the last page that I read, and I'm gonna make you wait for part 3. So I'm gonna go ahead and bookmark and like, subscribe. I would say comment, but I turn comments off because this is a channel for kids and for people who want to read books. So thank you for watching and listening. Stay tuned for part 3.